Buddham saranam gacchami, Dhammam saranam gacchami, Sangham saranam gacchami, Bahudeva manusache Mangalani achintayam Akankhamana sothanam Brui mangalamuttamam Asvevanacha balanam Panditanancha sevana Puja cha pujaniyanam Etang mangalamuttamam Patirupadesavasuche Pubbhe cha katapuyata Attasammapanidhiche Etang mangalamuttamam Bahu satchancha sippancha Vinayo cha susikito Subhasita chaya vacha.
So firstly, I must thank those students who recite the
Mangala Sutra.
Mangalam. Mangala Sutra. You are the generation of 21st century. Many of us belongs to generation of 20th century. So 20th century, when we look back 20th century, too much violence, too much killing. First World War, Second World War, then Korean War, then Vietnam War, and also immense civil war in Russia and China. So according to some historian, they say around 200 millions of people killed through violence, through war. So such immense violence, about 200 people killed, sacrificed their life, really create a better world, then okay, we can say. Immense violence, however, you see, creates new, better shape of the world. That not happen. So even today, beginning of 21st century, still violence there, killing there. These are the impact of 20th century's sort of too much violence, and the people believe whenever they face some obstacle, they always think, you see, use force. So that actually outdated. So now, 21st century, we should build century of peace. Peace not through prayer, but through our own sort of practice. Here, the India's sort of 1,000-year-old tradition, ahimsa, that's now very relevant to today's world. So I very much appreciate those young students. You are really the generation which we, everybody, now hoping you can create better world, peaceful world.
So whenever I meet bhikshus, monks, and nuns, and also religious people, I raise this question that we are in the 21st century. So since the 18th and 19th centuries, and particularly 20th century, there has been lots of advancement in science and technology, and accordingly in the material development in the world. And so in this 21st century, science and technology, with its advancements in technology, the society that we live in has also prospered a lot. And so at such a time, when we see so much material development, my question that I ask is whether religion is something needed and relevant or not. So now 2018 in this 21st century is coming to an end, and we are going to enter into 2019 soon. So the 7 billion people on this earth, if we look at their situation today, of course there has been so much material, external material development, and there are countries which are still developing. But if we look at the condition or the situation of those highly developed countries, despite the material development and progress and prosperity, we see that there is a mental and psychological disturbance in many people in these nations. So at such a time when there is some kind of an issue amongst people, what happens is people easily take to weapons and using force. So we have so much building of weapons, arsenals, and people are even engaging, nations are even engaging in selling these weapons to one another. And there is danger of abusing these weapons and the force or the power that people have to kill others, to abuse others. And then today, even the scientists say that the basic human nature is compassionate. So the scientists are saying so. So the reason they give is that even at the infant stage, when the child has not yet developed language, and such an infant, when they see children playing and helping one another, shows joy. Whereas if children are actually having competitive sense of competition and also sense of harming one another, then this infant shows rather unhappy face. And so I have seen such movies or films. And so all of us We were born from our mother and were nurtured by our mother. Under her affectionate care, we were given and nurtured with her milk. So at that stage of infant, when a baby, if we were neglected by our mother, then if we had been neglected by our mothers, we would have died. And then from our own experience, we see that the more compassionate and loving we are, we create an environment or atmosphere which is also very peaceful. And people are more peaceful and happy and joyous when they are not disturbed in their mind. Whereas if we are disturbed mentally, and people, if we are constantly overcome with anger and fear and anxiety, then our immune system also is weakened. So the scientists are saying this. So peace, which is rooted in compassion and love, is something which is needed in today's world. So if we go to supermarkets, malls and so forth, to buy and shout that I want peace of mind, people would actually see us as a laughing stock. So peace cannot be bought from outside. It has to be developed from within one's mind. And so all the religious traditions of the world, all of these religions, I usually say that these are human religions, religions of human beings. They are not unrelated to humans, something that is just for the gods and goddesses. So we have the religion, which are human beings' religion. And because we regard love and compassion highly in our life, therefore all the religions also have the same message of love and compassion. And to develop it further, there are the different philosophical views of the religious traditions. On the one hand, we have the theistic religious traditions, believing in Creator God. And the God, the Creator, according to these religions, is not full of anger, but is full of love. So God is seen as almighty, compassionate, full of love and wisdom. So when you see the God having these attributes, and these religions say that we are created by such an infinite love, God. And so our Father, we are children of the same Father, who is full of love, whose nature is infinite love. So when we consider ourselves as children of that, such a God, children of the same Father, we would be able to see ourselves as brothers and sisters of such an infinite love. So therefore, we need to be harmonious and friendly with one another. And so this kind of theistic philosophical idea or concept, the purpose of such an idea is to be harmonious and to be compassionate and loving to one another. And so, as long as there is is love and compassion, there is peace in our mind. And if we let ourselves be overcome with anger, we would not have peace of mind. And so even the non-theistic religious traditions say that peace of mind. So on this earth, at a time when there is so much material development in the world, these material developments give physical comfort and not mental. So in other words, the material development gives us or brings us physical comfort based on sensorial experiences, such as having beautiful sights and also beautiful, interesting music for our ears, and through which we also experience some joy. And then also taste and smell, as well as physical touch, including sexual pleasure. So these are all sensorial experiences. So those who think only of material, in the materialistic terms, they try to draw joy and happiness, satisfaction on the basis of sensorial experiences, but not using our mental consciousness, through which we can develop peace of mind and joy, real, true joy. And so those who are obsessed with materialistic sensorial experiences are not so much trying to draw experience of happiness and so forth, using our own consciousness, mind, mental consciousness. Whereas love and compassion have to do with our mental consciousness. And this is what all the religious teachings advise us to draw or to develop happiness and joy within ourselves through love and compassion, which have to do with mental consciousness. Therefore, the religious traditions are something which are needed in even today. And in India, for over thousands of years, there has been the practice of ahimsa, non-violence, or non-harming. So if you have love and compassion towards others, you will not indulge in violence, harming others. And India has this secular way of practicing non-violence, secular way, and also ahimsa is practiced based on religion as well. So, in other words, ahimsa or non-violence can be practiced in a secular manner as well, and therefore this is what Indian tradition presents. Whereas in the West, when we use the term secular or secularism, they have this it has a connotation of disrespect to religion and demeaning or looking down upon religion or something like that. Whereas in India, of course, secularism doesn't have that kind of connotation. It has the connotation of, in India, some of my friends have told me that in India, in the ancient times, there was a school of thought called Charvakas, hedonists. And so this school of thought was criticized by the other religious or school philosophical thought traditions, whereas the practitioners of Theravada, Changsong, Rishi. And so the practitioners of Theravada tradition were referred as rishis or sages in India. So Indian understanding of secularism or secularity is respecting all religions as well as those of the atheists as well. So it is a very broad-minded understanding of secularism. And so from amongst the 7 billion people, there are over 1 billion who are not believers of any religious faith. So if we base our practice of love and compassion and so forth on religion alone, then these people are left out. And so, because religion is something, religion teaches love and compassion, which is not necessarily a religious matter, and therefore the Indian understanding of secularity, respecting not only the religious people or religions, but also those non-believers. So it's very befitting in today's world as well. So the Indian term ahimsa or non-violence respects non-believers as well as respecting all religious traditions. So this tradition has existed in India for the last over 3,000-4,000 years, and so this is something which is relevant in today's world. Why? Because in today's world, though the religions which teach love and compassion, just because of small difference in their name, they fight with one another. Of course, in India also in the past, in ancient times, there have been fightings in the name of religion. I don't know if there had been fightings and battles in the name of Buddhism as such in the past in India, but today we have such a thing happening in Burma. So in many parts of the world, because of the difference in religion, there are fightings that are happening, and particularly in Afghanistan and Bangladesh, Syria, and Yemen, and other areas. Though people are following the same religion, Islam, but because of the difference in their name, Shia and Sunni, people kill one another. For example, at this time, on this very occasion, we are here, peaceful. But at the same time, if we look at these regions, people are killing one another in the name of religion because of small differences in their religions. So the thousands of year old secular principle, which respects all religions and also non-believers, it's very important for us to take an earnest lesson from this. So my first commitment is to have a compassionate heart within ourselves as humans for a peace of mind, to control our mind. And then my second commitment is creating or bringing harmony amongst the religious traditions of the world. So all the major religious traditions of the world coexist in India. So in India, we have never heard of fightings between the Shia and Muslim communities. So ahimsa is something which is very relevant in today's world, this Indian tradition of ahimsa, and it is necessary in today's world. Since I came to exile in India, it's been nearly 60 years now. And so, during this period of time, the religious harmony in India is really, truly something which is in today's world beneficial and needed, necessary in today's world. All these religious traditions with different philosophical ideas, of course, philosophically they are different, but they are needed for us. Even amongst the religious Buddhism itself, in the Nalanda tradition of Buddhism, we have the 4 schools of thought, Vaibhashikas, Authantikas, Chittamatras and Madhyamakas. So amongst these 4 different philosophical schools, there are lots of arguments and criticisms to one another. But these criticisms and arguments are used not to create disharmony, but to actually do more investigation into the teaching of the Buddha for our spiritual and mental development. And therefore, the religious harmony in India is something which is very precious. So in modern India, also, this religious harmony is something amazing, which could be used as an example, or India could be a role model for the rest of the world. In terms of religious harmony, we need to be able to, I usually tell Indian friends that we need to be able to actually present this religious harmony that exists in India. And I've been telling Muslim brothers and sisters that whom I meet, they could do something to present this religious harmony in India to their brothers and sisters in the Middle East and so forth. So in India, which has over 1.2 billion people, religious harmony has existed for over thousands of years. And therefore, this shows that it is possible for the rest of the world also to follow suit. And therefore, I urge the Indians to show the rest of the world religious harmony is possible. To serve as a role model for the rest of the world. So one of the things that I endeavor in today's world is this very excellent Indian tradition, the excellent Indian tradition which has been neglected in modern India, which has become more materialistically oriented. I'm not saying people have to be religious as such, but to practice these principles in a secular manner, which is an Indian tradition from the past, an ancient Indian tradition. So India is the only nation or country which can combine both the traditional values which are learned in Indian tradition of psychology and logic and so forth, with modern knowledge, modern material development. And so India is the only country which can combine these two in modern world. So regarding myself, as far as I'm concerned, I'm a student of the Nalanda tradition, which I have studied since my childhood, and therefore I see that ancient Indian knowledge and wisdom tradition is something which is necessary and relevant in today's world. And so this is what I endeavor to spread in modern India. So of course I'm Buddhist, and I have studied Buddhist philosophy quite a lot. Of course, I give talks on Buddhist philosophy, but I tell people that I'm not in there to spread or propagate religious Buddhism as such. Because whether someone, an individual, follows a religion or not, it is up to them. But when we talk about philosophical concepts and ideas, it could also be academic subject without touching any religion as such. And so the text that I'm going to teach here is one of the best works on Buddhism, but I'm not teaching it in order to propagate Buddhism as such. But it is a text which is very helpful, definitely helpful to people and beneficial to people. So as human beings, we naturally have an amazing, marvelous intelligence, whether we talk it from the point of view of religion or not, or evolutionary point of view or not, we have this marvelous intelligence. And as sentient beings, all of us are under the influence of our three poisons of desirous attachment, hatred or anger, and ignorance. And therefore, if we let this human intelligence that we have, this marvelous intelligence, become like a servant of these negative, destructive emotions, then it's very unfortunate. So we, as human beings, also have built all these weapons, which are very powerful to destroy others. So the usage of these weapons in the past is because of these destructive emotions, of course, while using our intelligence in a very destructive way. So as humans, when we use this marvelous intelligence, we can create immense happiness and joy amongst us. Whereas if it is used if this intelligence is actually becomes the slave of our negative, destructive emotions, then there is so much destruction that is caused to others. So whether we are able to, we would use this in a constructive or destructive way, in the short and long term, destructive or constructive ways. It depends on our intelligence as well. So the 6th chapter of this text, A Guide to the Bodhisattva Way of Life, teaches that of patience. So whether you believe in a religion or not, if you are overcome with anger, then you will never have joy and happiness. But if you see the disadvantage and the shortcomings of anger and try to counter it by understanding the positive consequences of patience and tolerance, then you will be able to have a happy life. And then the chapter number 8 shows or teaches that of altruism. Altruism is something that we need as social animals. If you look at animals, for example, dogs, if there is a dog which is actually unfriendly with other dogs, always barking at them and so forth, the other dogs would also such a dog would not be paid attention by other dogs, and then the dog remains lonely. And similarly, in human society, if someone remains very selfish, self-centered, then such a person will remain lonely. And so chapter 8 teaches the disadvantages of self-cherishing attitude, being extremely self-centered, and the advantages of caring or cherishing others over oneself. So 6th chapter teaches patience or tolerance, and it says that in order to practice patience, you need someone who is an adversary, and without whom you cannot practice patience or tolerance. And so it teaches how to counter one's anger and show patience. And the 8th chapter, if you study the 8th chapter, you'll understand that self-centered attitude is the cause of all your miseries and unhappiness. So whether you are a Buddhist or not, believer or not, these 2 chapters are very important. If you could read these 2 chapters and also give thought to them, it would be very beneficial. So we had a discussion of what would be good to teach here in Sankisa, and I said, let's have teaching on this Bodhisattva Charyavatara. If you have the book, raise your hands. So, of course, we don't have the time to read the whole text and explain the entire book, but there's nothing wrong in doing, in giving the succinct teaching on this book. A book giving the teaching explanation succinctly. So I wish to introduce what Buddhism is about. So the chapter 9 of this text, which is chapter on wisdom, all of these branches were taught by the Mighty One for the sake of wisdom. Therefore, those wishing to pacify suffering should generate with this wisdom. So, the 84,000 teachings of the Buddha are compiled into the 3 baskets of teachings or collections of teachings, the Vinaya, Sutra, and Abhidharma collections of teachings. So the Buddhas give teachings in order to pacify our suffering. So how do we overcome suffering? The Buddha himself has said, the sages do not wash away the sins of beings, nor do they remove their suffering with their hands, nor do they transfer their own realization into others. But by teaching the truth, they help beings to liberation. And so, from the very beginning, when the Buddha generated or developed that of the altruistic intention to become a Buddha for the benefit of all sentient beings, and through to treading along the path to enlightenment, and then finally becoming enlightened, all of this happened because of wishing to overcome suffering of others. And so the Buddha has said that the sin or evil deeds of beings cannot be washed away by water by the Buddha, nor can they remove the suffering of sentient beings, the misery and difficulties. And the Buddhas also cannot transfer or shift their own realization into others. But how do the Buddhas help then? The Buddha says, by showing what are the causes of suffering and how to overcome them. And so from his own experience, the Buddha taught these paths, gave these teachings, and this is how the Buddhas help sentient beings to overcome their suffering. Therefore, this first verse says, therefore those wishing to specify suffering should generate or develop this wisdom. And so within the suffering there is the obvious painful experience, which is called suffering of suffering, and then there is also the suffering of change or changeable suffering, and then the deeper suffering, which is called the pervasive conditioning existential suffering. And so this is rooted in our destructive emotions, kleshas, which are in turn rooted in our ignorance. The rest of the negative, destructive emotions are rooted in ignorance, this misconception of reality. Whereas there are certain techniques to suppress or to weaken this attachment and anger and so forth, but they are not the final antidote to these destructive emotions. So the actual antidote or counterforce to all our destructive emotions is the wisdom, realizing the truth of how things are. And for that we need to develop, first of all, the practice of discipline or morality, and within that practice we have that of mindfulness and introspection. And so on the basis of morality we develop single-pointed concentration, which is focused on one object single-pointedly, and on the basis of that we develop that of the insight, the penetrative special insight or vipassana. And therefore, in ancient Indian tradition, we have the practice of the three trainings, three shiksha, that of morality, concentration, and wisdom, or vipassana. So in the Indian traditions, there is the common understanding that the desire ram afflictions, these afflictive emotions or mental afflictions, bring about dissatisfaction. And therefore, there is the practice of developing single-pointed concentration and also seeing the desire ram experiences to be gross and the experience of the higher realms of existence as being peaceful. And therefore, there is the practice of vipassana within that understanding. And so the Buddha himself followed this tradition which existed in India, and practiced morality, concentration, single-pointed concentration, and this special insight. And so, from his own experience, the Buddha saw that this insight, or the considering the higher realms of existence to be more peaceful than desire realm, and accordingly trying to achieve that, is not the antidote to our negative emotions. And therefore, the Buddha taught that of the selflessness. Whereas in the Indian tradition in the past, all the practices are based on the idea of a soul theory, an independent self. The Buddha rejected that and taught selflessness. And so the wisdom here referred in the first chapter, in the first verse, is the wisdom realizing selflessness mainly, which is the antidote to the rest of the destructive emotions. So the branches, all the branches of teachings refer to those of morality, patience, giving, or generosity, and so forth. And on the basis of these practices, then wisdom is cultivated. And that wisdom, realizing selflessness, is the actual antidote to our negative mental afflictions. And this is also in order to overcome all mental afflictions or destructive emotions and mental afflictions, as well as their residual stains. You need to develop that of bodhicitta, this enlightened spirit of enlightenment, or bodhicitta. And with the help of bodhicitta, you can even overcome these residual stains of the afflictions, the mental afflictions. And therefore, what has been taught prior to this chapter are considered the branches. All are the branches, including that of altruism. And then, on the basis of them, we will develop the wisdom, realizing selflessness to overcome all the destructive emotions. So, Master Nagarjuna says that all the Buddhas gave teachings on the basis of the two truths, which are the conventional mundane truth and then the ultimate truth. And so he also says that without relying on the conventional truth, you cannot understand or fathom that of the ultimate truth. And so after the Buddha became enlightened, the first teaching or statement that he made was this profound, peaceful, unelaborated or unfabricated, luminous, uncompounded, unconditioned, nectar-like dharma I have discovered, and even if I were to teach it to others, nobody will understand me, and therefore I'll remain silent in the forest. So what the Buddha actually meant by this is that if he were to teach this to others, this profound, peaceful, unelaborated, unfabricated, luminous, unconditioned, this nectar-like dharma he has found. So regarding this phrase, the profound and peaceful refers to the first dharma wheel, and the unfabrication refers to the second wheel of dharma, and then the luminous unconditioned dharma refers to the third turning of the wheel of dharma. So in the first teaching of the Buddha, the first sermon that he gave was on the Four Noble Truths. And then in the second turning of the wheel of dharma, he gave the teaching on the perfection of wisdom. where he said that things have no essential independent existence as such. And therefore, in order to understand that, there is an interpretation that is given in the third turning of the wheel of dharma, which in the aspect of which is the Sandhi Nimochana Sutra, wherein the Buddha interprets himself by saying that the reason why he taught that things have no essential independent existence is by thinking of the mode of the three natures. And then another aspect of the third turning of the wheel of dharma is the Tathagata Garbha Sutra, where he teaches the nature of mind is luminous and clear light or clear light. And in Tantra, there is the practice of using the luminous clear light mind and turning it into the path. And so the Buddha said, I have discovered or found this nectar-like dharma, which is peaceful, profound, peaceful, unelaborated, luminous and unconditioned. So, on the basis of understanding of the causality of things, he taught that of the more profound understanding of how things are relative or dependent on other factors, and then he taught that things have no independent existence on the basis of that dependent origination nature of things. And so in the first sermon, the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths, which are the truth of suffering, true origin, true cessation, and true path. And he gave teaching on these in three aspects, by referring to the nature of the Four Noble Truths and the functionality of them, and then the fruit of the practice based on the Four Noble Truths. And then each of these Four Noble Truths also were explained in terms of their four aspects each. For example, impermanence, suffering, empty nature, and selflessness are the aspects or characteristics of the first Noble Truth. And what this shows is that things have their causes and conditions, and they cannot be produced. Things cannot be produced from phenomena which are not impermanent, which are permanent. Permanent things cannot create others, and that things do not come from nothingness. So if things were to arise from factors which are permanent, then you cannot have change. They cannot be subject to change. And therefore, the cause must be impermanent or changing. And not only that, for example, in the case of suffering, it is an experience which is unwanted, undesired, uncomfortable, and therefore it must have its own compatible cause. So there must be a compatible cause which is impermanent, and and therefore there's a teaching on what is known as a potential cause or condition. So when the Buddha said that suffering and experiences are based on causes and conditions, so that is like using logic. And because things have their causes and conditions, therefore they are dependent. And therefore, on the basis of the understanding of dependent nature of things, the Buddha further gave teaching on that of the emptiness. So on the basis of understanding emptiness, then the true cessation of suffering is taught. And so the first sermon lays the fundamental foundation of Buddhist teaching, Buddha's teaching. And then he gave further teaching on the true cessation and in the second turning of the wheel of dharma. Because misconception of reality or ignorance is the root of all other mental afflictions, which in turn bring about suffering. So the ignorance which grasps at some kind of independent self, how does that happen? So on the basis of viewing our psychophysical aggregates having some kind of independent existence, therefore the grasping at an independent self arises. And so the Buddha gave these three turnings of wheel, set the three wheels in motion. The first turning of the wheel of dharma, leading to the second turning, and then the third turning. And so this sequence can be understood in terms of how one can overcome not only the mental afflictions, but also the stains, residual stains of the mental afflictions. And therefore the Buddha taught that of the Buddha nature, Tathagata Garbha, which permeates all sentient beings. And so, as it is said in Uttaratantra, Mahayana Uttaratantra by Maitreya, so even in quantum physics, the appearance is not the reality, it's what they teach. So things do not exist the way they appear to us. The quantum physicists say that things have no objective reality. So when you dissect things, of course they are dealing with matter, there's nothing that you can point your finger at being this and that finally, which is very similar to the philosophical understanding or assertion of the Chittamatras, the mind-only school of Buddhist philosophy. And because they see that things have no objective existence, they say that things are dependent on observers. So as long as there is an observer, there is an observed object. And apart from the observer, they say there is no observed object as such. And so what is taught in the Mula Madhyamaka Karikapa and Nagarjuna, that things have no objective existence, that things are our mental projection. And one scientist, some quantum physicist in mainland China has said that someone who is fully convinced that there is no objective reality, and for such a person, their reaction to emotional reaction to things is not in black and white terms. And so in the Buddhist philosophy, the things do not exist the way they appear, but then things do exist by way of designation, or conceptual designation. So when it comes to, of course, so far quantum physicists have not focused on the observer. They do not have much understanding or explanation of the observer as such, but they have observed, what they observed is the material things. And so when they are able to see that things, matter, do not have any objective existence, slowly they might also come to the understanding that the observer also has no objective existence. So just as the psychophysical aggregates have no objective existence, when one is convinced that the psychophysical aggregates, the five aggregates, have no independent existence whatever, then that can actually induce an insight into how the self or a person also does not have any independent existence. So with regard to dependent origination, the causality and also dependence through designation are explained in conventional terms. So why why causation happens is because things are dependently arisen, whereas things are dependently originated. If you try to pinpoint at this and that thing which are designated, nothing can be found whatever. And therefore, there is the teaching on the two truths. In the ancient Indian tradition, the two truths are taught. For example, in the case of Sankhya school, they say that the primal factor and that of the conscious self are permanent or ultimate reality, whereas the rest of the evolutes, as they're called, are relative or conventional. So I also wish to say this. Maybe you have heard this before. So here, when it says that when it says the ultimate is not the object of mind, and mind, because the mind is conventional. Lama so in the next verse, the two types of persons are seen. The yogis and the common people. And common people, it says that the further among the yogis, the differences in their understanding progressively in their higher views progressively contradicts those with the lower views. And so what is meant by the ultimate being not object of mind here, the mind refers here to the dualistic mind, whereas the latter, where it refers to the yogis amongst themselves differ progressively in their mind, refers to the non-dualistic mind. So Buddhism does not believe in a creator God. And within the Indian tradition, there are the non-theistic Sankhya school, as well as the Jainism. They do not also believe in creator God. So, but apart from these three, of course, despite not asserting any creator God as such, Jainism and Sankhya school also do believe in an independent soul. So Indian traditions, amongst Indian traditions, except Buddhism, the rest of the schools believe or assert an independent soul or self. And in the West, the Western religious traditions also believe in an independent soul. And so what we need to overcome is this grasping at an independent self. And so by understanding that the lack or absence of independent self, you need to overcome this grasping at an independent self. And so this is taught only in Buddhism and not the other traditions. So, with regards to emptiness, we establish emptiness on the basis of something on which we establish it, an object, or there has to be a subject on the basis of which we can talk about emptiness. Without that, you cannot talk about emptiness. And all of us, followers of the Sanskrit tradition, recite the Heart Sutra, where it says, form is empty, emptiness is form, emptiness is not other than form, and form too is not other than emptiness. And before that, there it says, the five aggregates should also be seen as empty of intrinsic nature. So on the basis of understanding that there is something that appears and based on that we can talk about emptiness. And Master Nagarjuna says what is dependent on origin is said to be empty, and that is designated, and that is the middle way. And since there is nothing which is not dependently originated, therefore there is nothing which is not empty. So, in other words, the Prajnaparamita Sutras teach the two truths, the reality or the truth, which is emptiness, indicates that when we try to investigate into the nature of things, we cannot find anything that we can point our fingers at being this and that. In that ultimate analysis, nothing can be founded, and therefore things are said to be empty. And not only in the case, in the sense of causality, where effects arise through causes and conditions, and not only that things are, the whole is dependent on its parts, but also that things are merely designated. Mere conditionality is emphasized in the Prasangika Madhyamaka, where this understanding that things are merely conventionally and imputed or designated. And so when you are able to understand that, then you'll be able to establish, while things are empty of intrinsic nature, there is conventionality of things. And therefore, Master Nagarjuna is saying that there's liberation through the ending or extinguishing of the mental afflictions, and mental afflictions and karma are rooted in our conceptual elaboration or exaggerated outlook, and this in turn is rooted in our fabricated view, and this is ended by emptiness. And so even the scientists are able to say that things have no objective existence. And all the religious traditions also teach that there's need for love, cultivating love and compassion. In Buddhism, what is said is whether it's external things or internal experience of the mind, there is an appearance, but things, the reality is not the appearance, or the appearance is not the reality. From our own experience, we can tell that when we develop bodhicitta through the practice of equaling and exchanging self and others, so we are able to counter our selfish attitude. Whereas when we are able to gain insight into things being merely designated, that things do not exist the way they appear, this helps in countering the ignorance which grasps at some true independent existence of things. And so what counters or slaps in the face of in the face of self-cherishing attitude is cherishing others over oneself. And when we take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, we say, I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Sangha, Dharma, and I take refuge in the Sangha. And so the actual refuge is that of the Dharma refuge, Dharma jewel, which comprise of true cessation and true path. And so, by understanding the two truths, we need to be able to see what ignorance grasps at, and we need to be able to see ignorance itself being misconception, and then accordingly overcome it through understanding or gaining insight into the truth and reality of things. And so, true cessation and true path are generated or developed on the basis of understanding emptiness. And therefore, those who have the experience of the true cessation and true path are considered or regarded as the true Sangha jewel, who are the assistants on the path. So, engaging in the Bodhisattva deeds or the guide to the Bodhisattva. What is a Bodhisattva? Who is a Bodhisattva? What does it mean? So, someone who observes sentient beings through compassion, and those who observe Bodhi or enlightenment with wisdom. So someone who is dedicated to work for the sentient beings through compassion to reach enlightenment. And therefore, in order to be able to do that, one first needs to reach enlightenment in order to help others. And therefore, wisdom is needed, which understands the possibility of attaining enlightenment, understanding that however strong the defilements may be in oneself and others, there is always an antidote that it can be overcome, because there is a powerful antidote or counterforce to that. And therefore, by understanding that there is a possibility to attain enlightenment or Buddhahood through wisdom, then one sees sentient beings swayed by mental afflictions, and that they are helpless in the ocean of misery. And therefore, you are not only motivated to liberate sentient beings, you are actually motivated to help them out of suffering. Because of their ignorance, they are causing themselves more suffering. And therefore, in the practice of bodhisattvas, there is the motivation, which is the bodhicitta, and then there's the deeds which the bodhisattvas engage in, and then the practice of the six perfections, and then the resultant stage of Buddhahood. So, by understanding the general structure of the Buddhism, the system, and particularly the Sanskrit tradition, understanding it, some scientists who take interest in Buddhism say that Nalanda tradition is scientific, which can actually go parallel with science. The Buddha himself has said, just, O monks and scholars, just as gold is tested by burning, cutting and rubbing, likewise, you should examine my teaching and then accept it, not because you have faith or devotion in me. So, as I usually say, as Buddhists, we need to be 21st century Buddhists, which means that you need to understand what the Buddha Dharma is about, and then on the basis of that kind of understanding through study and logic, when you say, I take refuge in the Buddha Dharma, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha, then it'll make sense to what you mean by Buddhism and mean by being a Buddhist. Otherwise, without understanding that what the Buddha's teaching means, even if you may recite this verse 100 or 1,000 times, it may not have much effect. The Nalanda tradition of Buddhism was introduced in Tibet by Master Abbot Chandarakshita, and we are following what he has introduced to us. And so the students of Buddhist philosophy, Buddhism in Tibetan tradition, spent 20, 30 years in pursuing the studies of Buddhist philosophy, logic and so forth, metaphysics. We follow the system of what is known as the rejection or refutation of others' positions, establishing one's own position, and then rebuttal of criticism to one's position. So in this way, we pursue the study of Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy, and so through logic. And Lama Chenpo Sapa will give a review session in the afternoon at 3 o'clock. So please be at the venue by 2:30. This is an announcement from the organizer.